Well, good evening once again. I'm glad you're all back for this second talk on personal eschatology, the death of the individual and what the Orthodox Church teaches about that and how it views the transition from this life to the next life. I gave a couple of introductory caveats when I began speaking yesterday, saying that the fathers are absolutely consistent in telling us when we talk about death, we must be reticent about a number of things, because many of the details, many of the realities of the transition from this life to the next have not been revealed to us. And if these things have not been revealed to us, it is not for human beings in their arrogance to try to fill in the details. However, we do believe that certain things have been revealed to us. And these things that have been revealed to us have been revealed to us for our benefit, to strengthen us and to prepare us for a death that is fitting, that's proper, that is a holy death, and that will ensure repose in God. Yesterday, I talked about anthropology. It's important that if we're going to understand what death in the Orthodox teaching is all about, we have to have proper theological context. The first element of that context is we have to understand what the Orthodox Church teaches about human beings, what human beings are, how they were created by God, and why they were created in that particular way. Remember, we said that the basic conception of Orthodox anthropology is that human beings were created by God purposely to be psychophysical unities of body and soul. That's what constitutes us as persons. And we said that the aim of salvation is not just to save our souls, the way many of us have been taught in the past, but to save us as persons, in our totality, in our completeness. God's salvation is for us as whole persons. What that means is, then we have to look at death as an unnatural, traumatic event in a way, because it violates the personhood of the individual. The soul separates from the body, but we said that this is not something that ends the consciousness of the soul. Remember, we spent a good deal of time yesterday talking about the nous, this highest perceptive ability of the soul that continues in awareness after the soul is separated from the body at death and the soul is in the presence of God. That noetic awareness is what we have to concentrate on when we look at the soul after death. I also gave another caveat, and I said that in talking about death, the Orthodox Church uses a lot of imagery in its patristic writings, in the services of the church, and so forth. It is a mistake, and a mistake a lot of people make, to take this imagery in a crudely literal way. When you take that imagery in a crudely literal way, you get into all kinds of trouble. So what we will be examining at the end of the talk today, and then tomorrow and the next day, is that imagery of the prayers and of the writings and how we're to understand what it reveals about what happens after death in terms of judgment and preparation for the last day, the second coming. So, one last point from yesterday. We said that beneath all of the imagery of the language, what happens to the soul after death is it enters a different spiritual reality that does not have spatial coordinates. It's not a place that we go to in the sense of Poughkeepsie, for instance. All right? Spatial coordinates do not apply here, and yet there is a spiritual reality into which the soul enters. Now, today, I want to begin by talking a little bit about soteriology. A lot of you talked to me after yesterday, and they said, "Oh my God, Father, I used to be scared of death. Now I'm even more afraid of death." All right? Well, let me give you, yes. Well, you know, it's sort of hard to talk about death and be completely upbeat and joyful and jolly, but I'll tell you this. The theme tonight is that in the Orthodox view of things, God is on our side. All right? In facing death, God is here to empower, to redeem us, to save us. All right? God is not a force, a person that is vengeful and wrathful when it comes to our death. This is the central message of Christianity. That as a Redeemer, God is on our side to undo an injustice which death introduced into the world. So, I want to begin by talking about soteriology. Soteriology is the theology of salvation. That God, in seeing the injustice that had been inflicted upon not only human beings, but the entire world, was determined in his infinite love for us to save us. And that salvation that God directs toward us is directed to the overturning, the overcoming of death. So don't be afraid. You're empowered. And what I want to explain is how this empowerment can be ours in the fullest way possible. So, let's start with this discussion of soteriology, this understanding of salvation in the Orthodox Church. If I asked all of you, why did death enter the world? I bet you 99% of you could get it right. What would you say? It was because of sin. Adam's sin. Okay? It was the sin of Adam that introduces death into the world. After all, we read this in Genesis chapter 2, no? Where God says to Adam and Eve, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you eat of it, you shall surely die." Now there are two ways to read that. And I dare say that the Orthodox Church takes that injunction, takes that warning from the book of Genesis and reads it with a different perspective than many Western Christians do, and I dare say in a different way than you and I in our pasts read it. And that's the first and most important point I want to make in talking about Orthodox soteriology. If the quote says, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in that day you shall eat of it, you shall surely die," that can be construed in two ways. The first way is, it's a threat. I'm telling you, you go to that tree and you eat of it, and you're gonna get punished. So the idea that death was inflicted on the human race by an angry God who was very wrathful because of our disobedience says, "I'll show you, I gave you a rule, you violated the rule, and now here's the price you're gonna pay. You're gonna die." That's the way many of us read it in our past, right? The Orthodox Church, the consensus patrum, the consensus of the fathers, is rather different. When it says, "The day you eat of it, you shall surely die," basically the fathers say God wasn't threatening us. He was saying, when you eat of it, you will die, because he was simply stating the reality of the situation. If you eat of this fruit, a natural result of your engaging in this action will be that you will now taste death. Let me give you a homey example. If a mother is at home baking cookies in the oven, I don't know, what do you turn the oven up to make cookies? 350. Okay, that's pretty hot. Boy, you all make the same cookies, obviously, in the recipe. And you have that oven preheated to 350, and you have all the cookies on the tray, and you put the tray in the oven, and your kids are running around the kitchen. And you tell your kids, "Don't you come near this oven and put your hand on this oven. If you do, you will surely get burned." And then you leave the room. If your kid comes up and puts his hand or her hand on the oven, is it because you punished them that they got burned? No. It's simply a result of the action that they did. You see? And this is the way the consensus of the fathers interprets this verse. That death is simply the result of the disobedience of Adam, because what did that do? It alienated Adam from the source of life. By distancing himself, by his own free will, from the source of life, death was able to enter the scene. Now, rather than thinking of God as, "I'll get them because they disobeyed me," we think of God as being grieved, being saddened, being upset by this situation that now has been visited upon his creation. You get the difference? Was I able to make that clear enough? Now, with that kind of perspective of God's posture toward our death, one of the ways to alleviate our fear and trembling at death and what happens to us after death is to recognize that what God has done for us is to make us unafraid, in a sense, to provide the salvation that enables us to overcome this enemy, which he was grieved to see visited upon us as a result of the fall of Adam. The tyranny of death is something that grieves God. And as a result, God had to save us. He desired, out of his love, to redeem us from that, to save us from it. And of course, who articulates this very clearly in his writings but St. Paul? Okay? How many of you have Bibles here tonight? Okay, if you do, turn to Romans 5. Romans 5. All right, now, Paul, in Romans 5, chapter 5, verse 12, gives one statement which in a way sets the church's understanding for death's reign over us, the tyranny of death as it was established. St. Paul says this, Romans chapter 5, verse 12. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all have sinned. Okay? Now, this is what this says. Why did death spread to the whole human race? Easy. A concomitant of death, of sin, is death. All right? In that all have sinned. What St. Paul is saying is that we're locked into a vicious cycle as human beings. When sin entered the world, death was introduced. And because death is like a specter, always looking over our shoulders, always threatening us, and the greatest threat of death is what? Non-existence. Because this fear is always permeating our world, what does it lead us to do? It leads us to sin. For instance, if I'm dying of thirst, and you're dying of thirst, and there's this one cup of water, you and I are going to fight each other to get it. There's going to be violence and struggling against other people in order to preserve ourselves for fear of death. The fear of death leads us to sin. This also, by the way, happens on a psychological level. If we feel someone is somehow threatening our ego, okay, boy, we go to all kinds of extremes, don't we, to make sure that we're on top and we're not going to be threatened by that other person. How many sins spring from that kind of fear of extinction, self-extinction? So, St. Paul is saying, sin entered the world, and therefore death. The fear of death, always looking over us, leads us to sin. And therefore, the human race was caught in this vicious cycle that wasn't just a cycle, but it was a downward spiral. It gets worse and worse, carrying us down into this vortex. And so, he says, as a result of this spreading of sin, the stranglehold of death was becoming firmer and firmer, more and more impossible for human beings to even think of breaking free from. Now, our understanding of death as Orthodox is based simply on that fact, that because we all sin, we all die. In Greek, that's what the text says. Death spread to all, in that all have sinned. Okay? The Greek says very clearly, in that, epho, all, pantes, have sinned, hemarton. All right? So God isn't angry. He's just dealing with a situation that we have created for ourselves by having fallen away from the source of life. The idea of an angry God who's using death somehow against us, and therefore makes us fearful in the face of death, comes from a misinterpretation of this passage. The Latin that St. Augustine was using of this Greek text was a fairly faithful, literal translation of the Greek. The Greek says, all die, in that all have sinned. F ho pantes hemarton. So F was translated as in, ho is quo, pantes is omnes, all, and hemarton, have sinned, is pekaverunt, have sinned. So it's a literal translation of the Greek. But here's the problem that arose. In looking at this, in that all have sinned, Quo can be seen as a personal pronoun. So in interpreting it, St. Augustine didn't read it simply in that or because all sinned, but in whom all sinned. And who is the who in whom we all sinned? Adam. And so remember the little thing in one of the Puritan alphabet books? A, the little rhyme for A was, in Adam's fall, we sinned all. The idea that we, as human beings, were in the loins of Adam. And as we were born, the sin of Adam was transmitted to us. So, to say that death is the result of original sin, which is a responsible theological statement, it's the result of original sin, this is understood very differently by us Orthodox than it is in general in the West. Okay? Now, if original sin is passed down by just generations of human beings in the normal sexual transmission of life, that means that we all somehow have a deficiency, a blot, so to speak, a stain. I looked up original sin in one encyclopedia we have in our library upstairs, which I don't suggest you use. It doesn't come from an Orthodox background, but it defined original sin as a consequence of the sin of Adam. The hereditary stain with which we are born on account of our origin or descent from Adam. So the idea began to develop that because we inherited this stain, this culpability, because we are in Adam who sinned and Adam's sin became ours, we are deserving of death. For that reason, death being the inevitable result of this sin. Okay? The Orthodox understanding is somewhat different. The term original sin is used in Orthodox sources. But the more usual term in Orthodox sources is the ancestral curse, or the ancestral sin. And here's the way we tend to understand it. What Adam did was sin. All right? We all know that. No one's going to deny that. He alienated himself from the source of life in God. And what happened is when sin entered the world, everyone born into the world is infected by the power of sin and therefore falls victim to sinning. No one born in the world can free himself or herself from that tendency to sin. And because we all sin, we all die. Okay? It's not that we are born with some kind of hereditary imperfection, some kind of stain, or some kind of blot that makes us deserving of death because of the punishment that came as a result of the sin of Adam. It's that we are born into a world where sin is afoot, spreading here and there, and we are victims of it even before we're born by virtue of just being in this created world. Like I always say, for those of us who grew up in Pittsburgh, we were reaping the negative results of the sins of our ancestors by virtue of the fact that our mothers were breathing the air that the steel industry had produced for us in Pittsburgh, and I was affected by that even before I saw the light of day. Okay? So this idea that the human condition is permeated by sin as a result of this process that started with Adam, we're all affected by that, and as a result, we all sin and we all die. Okay? God isn't punishing us. This is simply the result of sinning. We distance ourselves from the source of life. So, mortality and corruption entered into the world, and that predisposes us to sin and assures that we're going to sin. And this effect, by the way, is not only on human beings. I think this is an important point to make, because salvation, the deliverance from death, as Orthodoxy sees it, is not just directed to human beings, but to the whole created order. And this is an important point to make these days when we talk about theologies of ecology, environmental theologies. And I'm tired, for one, because I teach in a college where I actually teach a course, Environment, Culture, and Values. And in that course, Christianity is often disrespected as a religious tradition that has nothing to say about protecting the environment. Christians are depicted as people who have systematically and relentlessly and ruthlessly abused the environment, destroyed it. But in reality, Christianity has a very exalted understanding of the environment because it believes that the environment all of creation, groans under this pain of mortality and corruption that was introduced into the world by sin, and it, just like human beings, needs to be delivered from this. That death as much afflicts the creation as it does human beings. Turn to Romans chapter 8. Paul says this very beautifully. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory which shall be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation eagerly waits for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it in hope. Because the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and labors with birth pangs together until now. And now, not only they, but we also who have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body. So you see this idea that all of creation has been affected by this infection of sin and this tyranny of death. Okay, so the 2 points I want to make at this first sort of section of soteriology is that God is grieved by our sort of captivity to death, and that this captivity to death must be undone. Only God can save us from that. And that not only us individually, but the whole creation awaits this liberation. Why was this seen as so overwhelming, so burdensome, so much of an affliction by those who dwelt in ancient Israel, in the ancient Near East? Well, if you look at what the ancient Israelites saw death to be, they saw it in very negative ways. And in order to understand how they understood death, you've got to know how they saw the world. The world in the ancient Near East was seen as basically flat. All right? Not as a globe. You had the land, the four corners of the earth, and over the earth, you had sort of like a bowl, an inverted bowl. And you had waters above the bowl, and what separated the waters above the sky from the waters below the sky was the firmament. All right? You have this inverted bowl in the midst of waters with a flat earth. Okay? The reason you had rain is because, the floodgates of the inverted bowl opened up and the water came in. All right? Stars studded the firmament. And the sun and the moon also moved in their courses in the firmament. The earth was on pillars. And underneath the earth was the underworld. Okay? The underworld. So the earth stood on pillars, and the underworld was this earth underneath the surface of the earth that was below the sky. Now, what the ancient Near Easterner thought, or the ancient Israelite thought in particular, that when you died, you entered into this underworld. This underworld is called, as most of you know, I'm sure, Sheol. And Sheol, translated into Greek, usually as Hades. All right? Now, this idea of the underworld in ancient Israel was that it was a non-world. That's probably the best way to describe it. What the world was, bright, light, vibrant, filled with life, filled with activity, well, the underworld, Sheol, was the exact opposite. It was dark. It was gloomy. It was dusty. It didn't have any activity. People there sort of lived in this kind of suspended animation. And so when you buried someone, the idea was that that person entered into this shadowy existence. And the only way that the people could express this was to say they were held captive there. Now, why do I bring this up? Because when we talk about the resurrection in Orthodox hymnography, what we often talk about is Christ delivering those who were in Hades, who were held captive there. Now, to understand the force of the Orthodox proclamation of Christ liberating us from death is we have to get into the mindset of ancient Israel that saw death as this shadowy, lifeless existence that held its inhabitants captive. All kinds of biblical verses reflect this. Let me just read you a few of them. Psalm 16, verse 10. For you will not leave my soul in Sheol, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. All right, the idea was to be in Sheol, to be held captive there, was something that needed to be undone. People wanted to be liberated from there. Psalm 116, verse 3. The pains of death encompassed me, and the pangs of Sheol laid hold of me. I found trouble and sorrow. Jonah, when he's in the belly of the whale, prays this way. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, he says, and you heard my voice. In other words, I'm already almost dead. In the belly of this whale, I feel like I'm in Sheol, this abode of the dead. And Job, chapter 17, verse 16 says, will they go down to the gates of Sheol? Shall we have rest together in the dust? This idea then, that Sheol was a holding bin for the dead, so to speak, the place where the dead went, where they were held captive, is something that really bothered the religious awareness of the ancient Israelite. Death was seen as a tyrant, and it had to be undone. It had to be overcome. The best hope you had, when all things were considered, is you would go down to Sheol in peace. If your kids were giving you a hard time, you would say, you're going to send my gray hairs down to Sheol in sorrow. Or you're going to send no hairs at all down to Sheol in sorrow. The idea was to go down to the underworld, this shadowy, dusty, lifeless place in sorrow. That was the ultimate and unbearable captivity. The best you could do then was to go down to Sheol joyful, after a full life. Every Sunday in Orthros, we use Psalm 88. Psalm 88. And this psalm really gives sort of a good description of what it means to go to Sheol. O Lord, God of my salvation, I have cried day and night before thee. Let my prayer come before thee. Incline thine ear unto my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave. I am counted with them who go down into the pit, go down into Sheol. I am as a man that hath no strength, free among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, whom thou rememberest no more. And they are cut off from thy hand. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me, and thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. Thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. Thou hast made me an abomination unto him. I am shut up, and I cannot come forth. Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction. Lord, I have called daily upon thee. I have stretched out my hands unto thee. Now look at this. Wilt thou show wonders to the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise thee? Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in destruction? Shall thy wonders be known in the dark, and thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? This is the way Sheol was depicted, the land of oblivion, where you were forgotten. But unto thee I have cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer come before thee. Lord, why castest thou off my soul? Why hidest thou thy face from me? I am afflicted and ready to die from my youth up. So this idea of Sheol as a place where you're cut off from other human beings, cut off from the life of the world, and alienated from God. This is how death was seen in ancient Israel, and this was the view of death that Christ had to address when he came to bring salvation.